The year was 1877, and the cold had a particular cruelty to it that autumn, a biting promise of the winter to come. For Cora, the cold was not just in the air that sliced through the threadbare wool of her shawl. It was a permanent resident in her bones, a deep chill that no fire could ever truly reach. She was a ghost in the raw, windswept town of Redemption, a place named for a hope it had long since forgotten how to offer. Her existence was a small, repeating loop of drudgery, rising before the sun to stoke the fires at the boarding house, hauling water until her shoulders screamed, and scrubbing other people's sins from their linens in tubs of steaming, lye-harsh water. She moved through her days in a shroud of silence, her face pale and still, her gaze fixed on the task at hand. The townspeople saw her but did not see her. She was simply the orphan girl, a piece of the town's grim furniture, arrived years ago on a wagon with a church group that had since moved on, leaving her in the care of a town that had none to give. Her parents were a faded memory, lost to fever on the trail west, their faces blurring into the vast, indifferent sky. Loneliness for Cora was not an emotion, it was the weather of her soul, a constant, grey overcast. She was 17, but the weight she carried in the slump of her shoulders belonged to a woman 4 times her age. Her home was a small, slanted room at the back of the laundry, a space that smelled perpetually of damp and soap. Its single window looked out onto a narrow alley where stray dogs fought over scraps. At night, she would lie on her thin straw mattress, listening to the wind howl across the plains, a sound like a thing grieving. It was a sound she understood. She had learned long ago that survival was a matter of making oneself as small and unnoticeable as possible, of expecting nothing, and therefore never being disappointed. Her heart was a locked room, the key long lost. Then the blizzard came. It did not arrive gently. It descended upon Redemption like a collapsing mountain, a furious, shrieking wall of white that swallowed the world whole. The sky vanished, the horizon dissolved, and the town was plunged into a churning chaos of snow and wind. People scrambled for shelter, doors were barred, and within an hour, the world beyond one's own 4 walls ceased to exist. Cora was caught just as she finished her work, sent out into the maelstrom by the laundry owner with a careless wave. "Hurry on home," the woman had said, as if Cora had a warm hearth waiting. The short walk to her room became a perilous journey. The wind tore at her, a physical force that sought to rip the breath from her lungs. Snow blinded her, stinging her cheeks like 1,000 tiny needles. She stumbled through the alley, one hand pressed against the rough-hewn wall of the general store, her only guide in the disorienting whiteness. It was then that she heard it, a sound so thin and fragile it was nearly lost in the gale's roar, a cry. She froze, thinking it was the wind, a trick of the ear, but it came again, a faint, mewling sound of pure distress. It was coming from a drift that had piled up against a stack of discarded crates. Logic, and the instinct for self-preservation she had honed for years, told her to keep moving, to get to her room, to block the door against the storm, but her feet would not obey. Something in that sound pierced the thick callus around her heart. She waded through the deepening snow, her skirts heavy and wet. There, tucked into a small hollow between the crates, was a cradleboard. It was intricately beaded, a work of art half buried in the snow, and strapped within its protective wooden frame was a baby. Its face was red with cold, its tiny lips tinged with blue. Its dark eyes were wide with a terror it was too young to understand. It was a native child, Lakota by the markings on the board, abandoned to the fury of the storm. For a long moment, Cora could only stare. She knew what the town thought of the Lakota. They were savages, a threat to be driven out, or worse, to be found with one of their children. It was a danger she could not afford. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to turn away, to pretend she had seen nothing. The storm would cover it. No one would ever know. It was the world's way. The world was a place of harsh, simple equations, and this child was on the wrong side of one. But as she looked at the infant, its chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate breaths, she did not see a savage. She saw a life as small and abandoned as her own had once been. She saw the same profound loneliness that echoed in the empty chambers of her own being. The wind howled its monstrous lullaby, and in its voice, Cora heard a demand. Not a choice, but a duty. With trembling, clumsy fingers, she unhooked the cradleboard from whatever it had been caught on, gathered the impossibly heavy burden into her arms, and turned her back on sense, on safety, on everything she knew. She carried the child into the storm, toward the fragile shelter of her room. The room was an icebox, the wind finding its way through a dozen cracks in the walls. The first thing Cora did was barricade the door, stuffing rags into the gap at the bottom. The world outside was gone, and now, inside this tiny, frozen space, there was only the storm, the crying child, and her own frantic fear. She unstrapped the baby from the cradleboard, her fingers numb and stiff. The infant's clothes were damp, its skin terrifyingly cold to the touch. Panic seized her. She had no milk, no proper food, no knowledge of how to care for a thing so fragile. The baby's cries grew weaker, a sound that twisted something in Cora's gut. She stripped off her own wet outer layers, down to her driest chemise, and then stripped the baby of its damp wrappings. Without a second thought, she pressed the cold, small body against her own skin, pulling her worn quilt over both of them. The initial shock of the child's coldness made her gasp, but she held on, wrapping her arms around it, trying to pour her own meager warmth into its failing form. The hours that followed blurred into a single, sustained moment of struggle. The blizzard raged, a relentless assault on the flimsy building. The room grew darker as the snow piled up against the small window, plunging them into a perpetual twilight. Cora lay on her mattress, the baby against her chest, listening to the rhythm of its breathing, a fragile counterpoint to the storm's fury. When the baby cried from hunger, she chewed a piece of her stale bread until it was a soft paste and nudged it into the corner of its mouth with her finger. It was a desperate, clumsy act of mothering, born of pure instinct. Days bled into one another. The world was reduced to the four walls of her room. The storm did not cease. It was a living entity trying to claw its way inside. The greatest enemy, however, was the cold. It was insidious, creeping, and a draft snaked in from a gap near the window frame, blowing directly onto the makeshift bed. The baby, who she had started to think of as simply little one, would shiver violently whenever the draft touched its face. Cora shifted, trying to block the stream of frigid air with her own body, but it was persistent. She saw the baby's face, so small and vulnerable, its breath misting in the air. A fierce, unfamiliar feeling rose in her chest. It was a feeling that had a name, though she did not dare speak it: protection. Without conscious thought, she cupped her hands and held them over the baby's head, forming a small shield to deflect the icy current. Her right hand, then her left, creating a small pocket of still air around the child's face. She held the position for hours. At first, her hands just felt cold. Then they began to ache, a deep, painful throb that radiated up her arms. Then the ache gave way to a burning sensation, as if she were holding them over a fire. Finally, the burning faded into a profound numbness. She knew it was bad. She knew what happened to flesh that froze, had seen it on trappers and ranchers who had misjudged the winter, but she could not move. The baby had finally fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep against her chest, its breathing even and steady for the first time. That was all that mattered. The world had shrunk to that single, vital rhythm. In the dim, snow-filtered light, she looked down at her fingers. They were waxy and white, utterly devoid of feeling. She tried to flex them, but they would not respond. A distant, clinical part of her mind registered the damage, catalogued the future pain, the loss. But the rest of her, the part that was curled around this tiny, trusting life, felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time, her existence was tied to something other than her own lonely survival. She had given a part of herself to keep another soul warm. The price was marked on her own flesh, a sacrifice made not for God or country, but for a nameless infant in a blizzard. And in that ruinous act, something inside her that had been frozen for years began, impossibly, to thaw. When the storm finally broke on the fourth day, the silence was more deafening than the wind had been. Sunlight, brilliant and sharp off the new-fallen snow, sliced through a crack in the boarded window. It felt like an intrusion. The world was returning, and with it all its dangers. Cora's meager supply of bread was gone. The baby was weak but alive, nestled against her. Her hands were a horror. The numbness had been replaced by an agony so immense it made her vision swim. The fingers on her right hand, the two smallest ones, were no longer white. They were turning a dreadful, mottled shade of blue and black. The knock on the door came that afternoon. It was loud and commanding. Cora's heart leaped into her throat. She clutched the baby closer, a useless animal instinct. "Cora, open this door. We know you're in there." It was the voice of Mr. Hale, the town's self-appointed custodian of morality and owner of the general store. Slowly, painfully, she got to her feet, her limbs stiff and protesting. She unbarred the door, her clumsy, swollen fingers barely able to work the latch. Hale stood there, flanked by the sheriff, a man named Donovan, whose face was a permanent mask of weary disapproval. Their eyes went from Cora's pale, defiant face to the bundle in her arms, and then to the cradleboard leaning against the wall. Hale's face curdled with disgust. "Sweet Mother of Mercy, it's true then. You brought a heathen savage into this town." "She's a baby," Cora whispered, her voice raw from disuse. "It's an Indian," Sheriff Donovan corrected, his voice flat. "Where did you get it?" "I found her, in the storm." Cora's own voice sounded foreign to her, stronger than she expected. She would have died. "Maybe that's God's will." Hale snapped, his piety a weapon. "You have no right. That thing is not your concern. It's a danger to us all. The tribe will come looking for it, and there'll be trouble." Whispers had already spread through the town like a contagion. A small crowd was gathering behind the two men, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. They stared at Cora as if she had grown a second head. She had crossed a line, broken an unwritten rule more sacred than any law. She had chosen the other side. "You'll give the child to me," the sheriff said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We'll handle it." "Handle it." The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them. "What does that mean?" Donovan's gaze was cold. "That's not your concern, girl. Now hand it over." He took a step forward. Cora took a step back, pressing the baby so tightly against her chest it let out a small whimper. "No." A gasp went through the small crowd. The orphan girl, the silent, invisible girl, was saying no to the sheriff. Hale's face flushed with anger. "You defiant little whelp. After this town has sheltered you, you bring this filth into our midst and defy the law." The pain in her hand flared, white-hot and blinding. An involuntary cry escaped her lips, and she swayed. Sheriff Donovan noticed her hand for the first time. "What, in God's name, happened to your fingers?" She cradled her injured hand with her good one, hiding it from their view. "It's nothing." "Nothing." Donovan's professional curiosity briefly overrode his purpose. "That's frostbite, and a bad case of it. You'll lose those fingers if they aren't seen to." "That's what happens when you consort with savages," Hale muttered piously. "It's a mark of her sin." The argument was cut short by a sudden shift in the crowd. A murmur of a different kind went through them, a sound of alarm. The people at the back began to move aside, parting like a reluctant sea. Into the space they cleared rode 5 figures on horseback. They were Lakota women, their faces etched with the gravity of their purpose. They were wrapped in thick buffalo robes, and they sat on their horses with an authority that made the sheriff and his bluster seem small and temporary. The town fell silent. The only sounds were the creak of saddle leather and the soft snorting of the horses. The lead woman, her hair streaked with silver and her face a beautiful map of dignified endurance, dismounted. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that commanded the space around her. Her dark eyes swept over the scene, taking in the hostile faces of the townspeople, the nervous sheriff, and finally, Cora. Her gaze lingered on Cora, on the tiny, dark-haired baby clutched in her arms, and then it dropped to Cora's ruined hand, which she was no longer trying to hide. The pain had made her careless, and the blackened fingers were in plain view. A younger man, who had ridden with the women, dismounted and stood beside the leader. He spoke to Sheriff Donovan in passable, if heavily accented English. "We are looking for a child, the daughter of Swift Deer, who was lost in the great snow." "The child is here," Donovan said, gesturing stiffly toward Cora. "This girl found it. We were just arranging for its return." It was a blatant lie, but he said it with a straight face. The lead woman, whose name was Winona, ignored him. She continued to look only at Cora. She spoke in her own language, her voice low and melodic. The young man translated. "She asks how the child survived the storm, mother." Cora swallowed, her throat dry. I found her. I took her to my room. I kept her warm." Winona spoke again, her eyes never leaving Cora's face. The translator relayed the question. "She asks what happened to your hand." Cora looked down at her grotesque fingers, then back up at the Lakota woman. For the first time she did not feel shame, only a strange, sad acceptance. The wind was cold. It came through the wall. I had to keep it off her face. She didn't need to say more. Winona's stern expression did not change, but something shifted in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that transcended language. She took a step closer, her gaze softening as she looked at the baby, who was now awake and staring back at her with wide, dark eyes. Then she looked back at Cora, at this pale, trembling white girl who stood defiant against her own people, who had maimed herself to protect a child that was not hers. She spoke a few quiet words to the other women. One of them, an older woman named Istas, with eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom, nodded slowly. Winona turned back to the translator. Her next words fell into the stunned silence of the alley. "We have come for the child," the translator said, his voice resonating with the woman's authority. "The child is our blood. We will take her." He paused, and Winona took another step, until she was standing directly in front of Cora. She reached out, not for the baby, but with a weathered hand, and gently touched Cora's shoulder. "But we will not leave the one who shielded her. Your sacrifice has marked you. Your heart is not the heart of these people. You have the heart of a Lakota mother. You have paid in flesh for this child. You are now kin. You will come with us." A collective shock rolled through the onlookers. Hale's jaw dropped. Sheriff Donovan looked utterly bewildered, his simple world of black and white and rigid lines suddenly thrown into chaos. He had expected a fight or a tense negotiation, not this adoption. "Now, hold on," Donovan started, finding his voice. "You can't just take her. She's one of us." Winona looked at him for the first time, and her gaze was filled with a pity so profound it was more insulting than any threat. The translator spoke her words. "She was never one of you. You saw an orphan to be used, a mouth to feed. You did not see her heart. We do. The choice is hers." All eyes turned to Cora. The world had split into two paths. Behind her was redemption, the town that had given her nothing but scorn and labor, the people who saw her as a sinner, a place where she would forever be an outcast, now even more so. Ahead of her were the strangers, the people she had been taught to fear, who were offering her something she had not dared to dream of for years, a place to belong. She looked down at the baby in her arms, this tiny being for whom she had sacrificed a part of her own body. She looked at her blackened, dead fingers, the price of that bond. And then she looked into Winona's steady, waiting eyes. Her decision was not made with logic. It was made with the deepest, truest part of her, the part that had been reawakened in the heart of the blizzard. She took a single shaky step forward, away from the sheriff and toward Winona. It was all the answer that was needed. One of the other women dismounted and gently took the baby from Cora's arms, murmuring soft, comforting words to it in their language. Winona put a firm, supportive arm around Cora's waist, taking her weight as she swayed, exhausted and overwhelmed by the pain. "You are safe now, daughter," she said in Lakota, and though Cora did not understand the words, she understood the tone. It was the sound of coming home. The journey to the Lakota winter camp was a dreamlike haze of pain and exhaustion. Cora rode on a horse led by Istas, wrapped in a thick, warm buffalo robe that smelled of wood smoke and sage. The world of redemption, with its narrow streets and narrower minds, vanished behind them, swallowed by the vast, white plains. The pain in her hand was a constant, searing fire, but every time a sob threatened to break from her, Winona would ride close, her presence a silent, steadying comfort. Their arrival at the camp was quiet and solemn. It was a collection of tipis nestled in a river valley, sheltered from the wind. Smoke rose from their peaks, a welcome sign of life and warmth. Cora was led immediately to a lodge set apart from the others, a healing lodge. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of herbs. The days that followed were a trial of fire and healing. The tribe's medicine man, a quiet elder named Kuruk, examined her hand with gentle, knowing fingers. There was no discussion, no false hope. The 2 fingers were dead. They had to be removed before the poison spread. The procedure was swift and brutal, performed with a sharpened obsidian knife and a searing brand to close the wounds. Cora screamed until her throat was raw, her body held down by the firm, compassionate hands of Winona and Istas. They did not leave her side. They bathed her sweat-soaked forehead, forced sips of a bitter, pain-dulling tea between her lips, and murmured to her in their soft, flowing tongue. In the long, slow weeks of her recovery, they cared for her with a tenderness she had never known. They brought her broth and stew, spooning it into her mouth when she was too weak to lift her head. They changed the herbal poultices on her hand, their touch always gentle. They spoke to her constantly, not demanding a response, but simply filling the silence with the rhythm of their language, weaving her into the sound of their lives. The baby, who she learned was named Chaitan, meaning falcon, was her most frequent visitor. His mother, Swift Deer, a young woman with haunted eyes, had died in the storm, thrown from her horse while fleeing a threat they did not explain. The women of the council were now his mothers, and by their decree, so was Cora. They would bring him to her, laying him beside her on the sleeping furs. He would watch her with his dark, intelligent eyes, sometimes reaching out with a tiny hand to touch her bandaged one, his touch impossibly soft. As her body healed, so did something deeper. The gnawing loneliness that had been her constant companion began to recede. It was replaced by a quiet sense of connection, a feeling of being woven into a fabric larger than herself. She was no longer Cora, the orphan. Here she was Ina Wanji, one mother, or Nape Sa, the one with the red hand. The names were given with respect, telling the story of her sacrifice. Learning their way of life was not easy. The language was a complex tapestry of sounds she struggled to weave with her own tongue. The work was hard scraping hides, gathering wood, grinding corn, but it was shared. No one labored alone. The laughter of the children, the murmur of the elders telling stories by the fire, the shared meal sit was a community of breath and blood and spirit, and they had made a place in it for her. Months passed. The snow melted, giving way to the tender green of spring. Cora's hand healed into a permanent, scarred reminder of her journey. The 2 missing fingers were a phantom limb, aching with memory, but the sight of her own altered hand no longer filled her with horror. It was a part of her story, a testament to the choice that had saved not only Chaitan's life, but her own. She learned to cook, to sew, to work with 1.5 hands, her movements becoming fluid and certain. One bright afternoon in the late summer of 1878, she sat outside the teepee she now shared with Istus. The sun was warm on her face. A short distance away, Chaitan, now a sturdy toddler, was taking his first wobbly steps. He stumbled and fell onto the soft grass, looking up at her with a comical expression of surprise. He did not cry. Instead, he pushed himself up, a look of fierce determination on his little face, and took another step, then another, his arms outstretched for balance. Winona came and sat beside Cora, her comfortable silence a language all its own. They watched the boy together, his small, triumphant journey across the grass. He finally reached Cora, tumbling into her lap with a happy gurgle. She wrapped her arms around him, her scarred hand resting gently on his back. The feeling of his small, warm body against hers filled the last empty spaces inside her. "He has your spirit," Winona said softly in Lakota. Cora understood her now, her ear long since attuned to the music of the language. "He does not give up." Cora looked down at Chaitan, then at her own hand, the visible proof of her transformation. She had lost a part of herself in the heart of that blizzard, but she had gained a universe. She had found that home was not a building or a town, but the shelter two souls could provide for each other. Here, among a people she had been taught to hate, she had found family. Here, in the shadow of her own sacrifice, she had finally, truly, been redeemed. The wind that blew across the plains no longer sounded like a thing grieving. It sounded like a song.